Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome to the launch of Ghost Geographies by Tamas Dobozy. We are so grateful to have everyone joining us in from Zoom, from far and wide, no matter what time of afternoon, evening, or early morning it might be for you. First of all, we would like to acknowledge that here at New Star Books, we are broadcasting from and have the solemn privilege of working on the stolen territories of the Coast Salish people of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. This land was never ceded, sold, or given up. And in the nature of this virtual event, we would also like to invite you all to take a moment to reflect upon the land that you are currently joining us from and pay respects to the First Nations custodians of that land. Before we get started, I would just like to make note of a few things here. Towards the end of today's launch, we will have some time for some Q&A. If you would like to step up to the mic, so to speak, as we might have if this was a live event, please feel free to use the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. It should be under the reactions button. In the case that you do want to ask your question, we just ask you to be mindful of the fact that this launch is being recorded and will be available online after the fact. If you would prefer to pop your question in the chat function, we will definitely be keeping an eye on that as well. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our host for today's launch. Matt Rader is the author of 5 volumes of poetry, a collection of stories, and a book of nonfiction. He teaches writing at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and he lives in Kelowna, BC. His latest book is a collection of poems, Ghost Hawk, from Nightwood Editions, and I will hand it over to you now, Matt.
Thanks, Melissa. Well, what a kind of surprise to be asked to do this, and also a real treat to be able to I don't know, I kind of started thinking myself as the person who gets to ask the most questions of Tamas, and that was since I have many questions and many things I would like to talk about, I feel very privileged. This is what the plan is, my plan, and we'll see how well we follow it, but I'm going to do a little, read the Tamas's bio. I think most of you probably know about his work. Some of you might not know all of it or parts of it. I'm going to have a little moment to frame the book as I see it and have a conversation with Tamas. We'll go back and forth on a few things, and then he's going to read a little bit from the collection, and I'll probably have a follow-up question. And I think that's kind of what we'll do, and then we'll open it up to some questions at the end. The plan is to try and keep this to about an hour. So that's what you've signed up for, and so you can buckle in. I have a long paragraph here of many things that Tamas has done. I'm going to read some of them. Tamas Dobozy is a professor in the Department of English and Film Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. He lives in Kitchener. He's published 4 books of short fiction: When X Equals Marylou, Last Notes and Other Stories, Siege 13 Stories, and Ghost Geographies Fictions, which we will come back to this distinction between stories and fictions later, along with a limited run collaborative work with the artist Alan Koch. I'm not sure if I said his name right. 5 Mishaps, which I just looked up online and looks really beautiful. I would like to see that book in person. Siege 13 won the 2012 Rogers Writers Trust of Canada Fiction Prize and was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award and the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award. His work has appeared in One Story, Fiction, Agni, Granta, won an O. Henry Prize in 2011 and the Gold Medal for Fiction at the National Magazine Awards in 2014. His scholarly work has appeared all over the place. He's written on music, utopianism, American literature, the short story, and post-structuralism. He's published numerous chapters in peer-reviewed anthologies. In other words, he's a real academic, unlike some of us. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tamas and to say something about Ghost Geographies, which I've spent the last few weeks reading and kind of going back into and talking about with the people in my life. saying like, I'm going to do this thing, and I don't know, like I'd have like a different idea about it every day, which I think is part of the design of the book. Like, I think the book is about the multitude of ways you can look at things, the many geographies and hauntings of our lives, the past and the future. I got so confused thinking about the past, history, and the future, and how they're connected to each other reading this book, that they started to blur into the same thing for me, which is very strange. This book is centered around a kind of an idea of utopia, or the possibility of a utopia. The idea of utopia as a nowhere place, as a place that doesn't really exist, but that inhabits and shapes how we think about the places we live in, the places we come from, where we're going to, and the weirdness of both the real lived experience and its conflict with the imagined geography of that place. So that's like my over like summary of the book. I feel like I could tell you a different version of it too, but Tamas, can you talk to us about utopias and these ghost geographies, which I take to be utopias?
Well, why don't we, I think, yeah, I almost don't think you need to say anything more than that. Why don't we start with the reading? Because I think that in some way frames exactly what you're talking about. And then yes, then let's talk about that. I think that's it.
Go for it.
I think the pronunciation is Kausch, Alan Kausch, but I could be wrong. I invited him tonight, but he is he's not as lucky as all of us to be able to have Zoom and internet. So he unfortunately couldn't make it, which is too bad. But his artwork makes that book. His stuff is incredible. He did the cover for Siege 13. That's the image. He did that. He's a collage artist. And so when I was approached to do that book, where it's a series where each of the writers is paired up with a visual artist, I asked Alan to do it, and boy, he made that book incredible. So I'm going to read the first 3 pages of a story called Ghost Geographies, which gives the book its title. Originally, I was going to call the book The Utopianists, but Rolf and Vlad, and I'm very happy they did talk me out of that title in short order and said, no, it should be called Ghost Geographies, to which I said, yes, you're right, it should be. So I'm going to read from that title story, just the first, just about 5 minutes in, try to keep it short. So this is the opening of that story, or of that fiction. If we're gonna talk about that idea, you can think of Shandor's map as a nation made of all the vacant lots in all the cities of the world. This is the closing line of the Ghost Geographies of Sándor Esterházy, a short exhibition catalog by Helga Brun, who is a colleague of mine at Wilfrid Laurier University. She is trying to define Esterházy's idea of utopia. We all know the places Brun is referring to: corner lots with faded for sale signs sinking into mud, abandoned t-shirts and underwear driven by years of wind into chain link fences and hardened in place, bits of wire and string hidden in the dandelions ready to snarl your feet, lost mementos you come upon, a locket with the face of a young boy, a bunch of letters bound in twine and warped with damp, a gilt-edged invitation to a silver wedding anniversary, 1978. Then there are the questions Brun's book asks. If you were to take these places and stack them end to end, would it bring together some nation broken up and scattered? Or would that country wave as its flag a sheet of frayed plastic? Or would it finally be better not to bring them together, since they're less about a country than a kind of placelessness, a nowhere, unclaimed, camouflaged from surveillance by being beneath notice, holes where you can safely step out of the order of things? What kind of government, if any, corresponds to the derelict? The answers to these, if there are any, seem entirely contained in the artwork of Sándor Esterházy, I've put his name in quotation marks because historians such as Bruin aren't sure that this wasn't a pseudonym. There is, in fact, very little they are sure of regarding Esterházy, except for the time and place of his death, November 13, 2002, in Fort Erie, a few miles from his favorite border crossing, the Peace Bridge. The coroner who examined the body said Esterházy was somewhere around 70, 75, though of course without paperwork, the exact year was impossible to determine. Esterházy spoke Hungarian, that much is certain, and the one or two people who knew him said he claimed to have been born in eastern Hungary somewhere, possibly Debrecen, and that he'd been orphaned during the war and had come to Canada or the US in the late 1940s and long ago lost any real identity papers. He was truly stateless. For most of his life, he lived in two locations, the Warspit Hostel in Buffalo, New York, and Maya Horvat's bed and breakfast just off Roncesvalles Avenue in Toronto, Ontario. He jumped back and forth across the border so many times it would be impossible to say which place or which country he considered home, though I'm guessing that his answer would have been neither or both, which is the same answer either way. His artworks, and again I'm using quotation marks because in all likelihood Esterházy did not consider his life's work art. For him, they were actual maps, are currently housed within the permanent collection of the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, which made a more convincing claim, not to mention financial offer, than the Art Gallery of Ontario. The works themselves became the property of the city of Fort Erie after Esterházy died. And though there was some controversy over whether the city should retain them or whether they should at the very least remain in Canada, financial gain eventually won out. Individually, the maps are astonishing, each one a beautiful object, but they add up to something much greater. Esterházy drew them on whatever paper came to hand, beer coasters, foolscap, the backs of postcards, even the waxy insides of cut and flattened coffee cups. And there's no consistency to them in terms of style, some being standard topographical surveys, some watercolors from a sidewalk perspective, some not pictures at all, but paragraphs. Quote, a fence 20 paces along the northeast corner, fallen over after that. The boards on the ground half rotted, filled with holes. The rest of the lot encircled by brambles roughly 200 paces in diameter. In his maps, the areas around the vacant lots, and sometimes there's more than one lot on each map, as many as 4 in the drawings of some of the poorer cities he visited, are left blank, and only the vaguest understanding of streets and housing developments and rivers and forests can be made out by how that blankness fits against the incredible detail of Esterházy's neglected places. The rest of the world just didn't exist for him. Each of the individual maps are slotted and the slots numbered so that you can fit them together into a larger map, as if it didn't matter that side by side you get an overgrown orchard outside Cleveland adjacent to a fallen tenement in Manhattan. They might as well be right beside each other in Esterházy's geography. Put together like that, the little maps become the old man's atlas, a country real enough in its details, but whose overall parameters are spectral. Only once has the Albright Knox ever mounted a complete exhibition, for which Bruin's book served as the catalog, and which ran from June 30th to October 31st, 2009. Esterházy's map geography does not lie flat, but rises and falls, with some of the smaller maps inserted into the ensemble vertically, while others come together to form protrusions, so that in the end, the larger map is rendered in a kind of illusory 3D. This is the landscape he spent so many years surveying, traveling back and forth across the border, and for which he ultimately died, his heart failing for the homeland he'd have given anything to see rise, not as some cardboard art project, but a new kind of country. Prior to the Albright Knox exhibit, the last time the map was set up in its entirety was in a room in a condemned house at the corner of Hurl and Dorsey Streets in Fort Erie. Rotten furniture and black mold and snowdrifts in the corners, windows broken open to the winter, and Esterházy's bent corpse wound in blankets with his cheek resting on the floor, frost on his lashes, eyes still open to what he'd spread in every direction before him across the windswept boards. His death seemed so small beside the map itself, and it was undoubtedly the picture taken of it at the scene and featured on the evening news that caught the eye of the curators at the Albright Knox and the AGO. The map spilled across the floor as if it had been poured from Esterhazy's eyes. I'll stop there.
I'm going to clap for everybody else. Thanks, Tamas. Now I'm thinking about fictions and about how much that story and some of the other stories in this collection borrow from a version of your real life self to like create a kind of verisimilitude, I suppose. And I also wanted to say, just on that I meant to say earlier, that I'm calling in from the Qualicum First Nation territory on Vancouver Island, which is very near actually where Tamas was born, in Nanaimo. And that one of our connections is that we grew up across the water from each other. I grew up in Comox and grew up in Powell River. So in a way—
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know you grew up in Comox. Oh wow.
Yeah. Okay. Always look across the way at the smoke rising up in Powell River. And thinking about how all of those geographies are shaping my like experience. Like even today, I did this thing with my brother that was based on this other idea from our childhood about, you know, splitting wood and living in the bush. And so maybe you can draw these things together. Utopia, like this sense of fictions that you're creating, which are in some ways a way to leverage real life.
Yeah, well, I was kind of interested in bringing together the idea of utopia as a fiction, as an idea of a better or more beneficent form of social organizing, that even while you're articulating it or reaching for it or attempting it, you know that it's bound to fail, that it's not going to work. And I was also interested in the idea of the difference between utopia as a place, which is technically how we normally think about it, right? So it comes from the Greek root, either utopos, which means no place, or utopos, which means beautiful place. And so scholars of utopia are always sort of dealing with this ambiguity of the root origin of the word. Which one is it? Or is it both? And the fact that it's both isn't that strange, because the beautiful place can never be a place. So the idea of utopia is a place, and then other kinds of thinking in which utopia, what's called processual utopias, where utopia is not about a place, it's about a disposition or a way of operating, a way of moving through the world and through time. So in fact, it is in fact placeless, because it's not aiming for arrival at some sort of post-historical perfect spot where there will no longer be any kind of difficulties or challenges, but rather the idea that what's important in the utopian is that we be mindful of instantiating it in our actions every day. You know, that idea, right? That without that disposition, without that mindfulness or that consciousness, you're never going to get to the place, because the place is predicated upon the people who are in it. And if that disposition is adopted sufficiently, it can truly be, you can achieve a kind of placelessness. You can achieve a sort of processual, ongoing engagement with that idea and move forward in a utopian vein that way. So that's sort of the two things that I'm kind of playing with there. And the Esterhazy story is interesting for me because that's exactly what Sándor Esterhazy was doing, was he was adopting that disposition where he refused to acknowledge borders, He refused to bow to authority, and where he adopted all these non-places that were outside of history, but only in the mode of travel and engagement and dialogue, not in the sense of, okay, I've made it, I'm done, my trials are ended. So that story kind of plays with that idea.
Is this idea related at all to the decision to call these fictions as opposed to stories?
Yeah, I think because some of them, like that one, are not really traditional stories in the sense of the kind of that slice of life narrative where you have description, characters, conflict and drama, and then some kind of resolution, and then the story's over. That sort of Chekhovian pattern. So a lot of the stories were written in opposition to that idea. And so what I was doing was borrowing other forms, like the essay, like the travelogue or the memoir. And then in the case of Nom de Guerre, as you know, the sort of biographical apparatus that comes at the beginning of critical biographies. I thought, oh, that would be a really interesting form to use to kind of work out some of these problems or difficulties that I have with that slice of life narrative form, which just feels played out to me, or at least I have a hard time playing it any further.
I mean, it's interesting though that fictions, like stories, can be true, fictional, imagine, but fictions are definitely saying that no matter how much truth is here, you should read this with a slice of the invented.
Yeah.
And that struck me as like something that might be important in thinking about how the utopias and the utopianists in this collection, they don't seem successful, or they seem like there's a, like at the very, some of them it's like a total disaster, and in other cases it's questionable, let's put it, maybe, so and your tone as the writer in this piece is like satirical, or at least lightly satirical. You're not, I don't know that I would say that you're making fun of or light of these things, but that you're there's a bit of comedy in seeing the errors of many of these characters.
Mm-hmm. Affectionately skeptical.
Yes. And I guess I like also reading it, I was thinking about, as a writer, and like this thing you were saying about the short story form and using other forms. Like I didn't read them as like abandoning the short story form. Actually, I read them as exactly what you described them as like borrowing from other genres in order to wring as much out of this kind of thing that you have like practiced. So, and in the book you have artists who do this exact thing, like create, in Black-Hearted Villains, you have a musician who's creating like has this one song that can be expanded in all kinds of like crazy ways, but it's also this tight thing. And I started thinking then about the utopian short story form, and like how much you carry that with you, and how do you have like what sense of like what makes a story for you then, given all of these genres. And
yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. It's working in the short story genre is you'd better be a utopianist, because you probably know this, right? Because in terms of the practical world and the commercial world of fiction, many publishers aren't interested at all in that. So I think I think short story writers and poets are kind of in the same place, maybe a little bit in that respect. I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. To what degree do I think of the writing of the short story as utopian?
Or even like in your own sense of, I mean, I get the sense reading your works, Siege 13, and this, that you have a real preference for what I would call a well-made story, like a story that has been thought out and is resonant, has resonant structural pieces to it, even if it's not proceeding in a you know, the slice of life, like classic narrative structure. So my sense was that there was some kind of almost story, Tamas Dobozy story that like holds up all of these things that the different forms are.
Yeah, I think there is a kind of I always think of the short story as like you're a watchmaker and you're trying to make sure all the little gears inside this tiny little frame all match up and they all work together properly to produce the correct time. That tends to be how I think of it. And oftentimes the story doesn't really start happening for me until I'm going back and I'm seeing problems. Like, oh, this doesn't work here because this ending is here. So I've got to change this. But if I change that, then this and this and this also have to change. And I still have to somehow get there. So you're just working with these really tiny pieces and trying to sort of make them all kind of mesh. And I've never successfully written a novel, but for me, when I get into a novel, I have all this space and all this room, and it almost works against me in the sense that I just lose momentum. I lose the vision. I wander off endlessly down profitless kind of corridors, thinking, well, what does it matter? I've got all this space, you know, I can disappear for 60 pages. And then I get to about page 150 or 175, and I think I could probably do all of this in 20 pages. And then I just cut it all and I get rid of it all and I just sit down and I do it. And then I'm like, well, I would have saved myself a lot of time if I just started out with that attitude. So the story for me, the limitations of the story or the frame of the story, the way it ties you down and the way it obstructs you is actually productive. It produces work in a way that not having those barriers there or not having those challenges there doesn't. So that's kind of where how I've ended up working in that genre over and over and over again. So, you know, it is in a way really an ideal space for me, because the problems that it creates are actually also the solutions.
I know talking about writing practice maybe isn't the most exciting thing for people who aren't writers. So I will wrap up that part of it very shortly, but I mean, it is exciting for me. So I guess listening to you speak about the short story, I was thinking about how much that vision of the story is a lot like the utopianists in the fictions. Like they have this there's something about the coherence of their vision that allows it to persist through all of these other things. And if it got too wild, too far out, it would like not be able to. It almost wouldn't persist. And anyway, I think there's.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's an obsessive compulsive component to all this. You know, there is. It's pathological. You know, like. Who sits down in front of a blank page every day to write a story unless there's really something wrong with you? Like, why would you do it? Sometimes I wonder, I just sit, I'm like, why am I here again, struggling and being grumpy and unhappy about it? And I think the characters in the story are like that. They just hold on to this tiny little thing, and somehow holding on to it both causes all their problems, but also saves them from other bigger problems that they might have, right? And by clinging to that little thing, it's like their talisman or something that helps them continue along. So it maybe what I'm doing is I'm just now that you mention it, is everything is in some way me thinking about writing in all kinds of different registers, and that's where the stories are coming about. I don't know, maybe.
I think so, and I think the answer to like why you would do it is in the book. Like I did not have this sense, despite their failures, despite the challenges, despite the kind of debris of selfhood. I think that is it comes in one of the stories. This is not a book that like left me feeling depressed, or like I felt kind of like really able to grapple with the world in a really interesting and lovely ways. And I think it's that multitude of possibilities. And I did at one point want to ask you about history, and I don't know how much you want to talk about Hungary, and like this is run through your other works too. But I did want to touch like on this idea of in one of your stories, which is a very strange and maybe the most like nom de guerre, which is like this kind of strange, as you were describing it, these autobiographical dateline kind of thing. There's a little twist to each one of those. That story blew my mind, because I tried to imagine you having to come up with the theories that were like, corresponding with Richard Rorty and things like this. But it was the part about the many worlds theories of like quantum physics and whatnot, and adding and bringing that into ethics, and this sense that like there are kind of infinite is even too small of a way to think about it, but like this some unlimited and aspects of ourselves. Each moment is creating a new life, and in this collection you have characters who are literally multiple people, right? Like they live multiple lives, and I felt like that was one of the gifts of the book, was this multiplicity of how to see everything. So even the failures have such beauty to them, and I wondered if you wanted to like anything I just said.
Yeah. I mean, that story was a really interesting for me to work on. I think I told you on email, I spent 5 years working on that story. It took me a long time to finish it. Part of it was the research, for sure. I was scrolling through endless lists of historical events for any given year to try and come up with exactly the right sort of piece to put in there for that story. What amazed me in going through all that detail was just the misery of human history. Unbelievable, just, one catastrophe to the next, famine, rape, murder, war, economic crisis. It was just this endless, sometimes only days apart, or even on the same day. And then I'd go to the next event trying to find it. And I just thought that what a great antidote to that horrific reality, the capacity to imagine yourself otherwise is, that really, when we talk about hope, we're talking about fiction, right? In essence, hope is fiction. It's the attempt to envision a story whose outcome plays differently with the facts, or even departs from the facts in a more hopeful direction. So that was part of what came to me in going through that material and trying to pick out the pieces that would fit into that kind of dateline that I'd set up. And then quite literally, but I was also playing with the idea in that story of fiction as a solve or remedy for guilt, for deep personal guilt, because a narrator or the main character of that story is essentially a deeply broken, flawed human being whose failures are always present in his mind, and who's in a way dreaming up these philosophical notions as a way of trying to outrun himself, right, and outpace himself. So yeah, so there's that. And then there's that sort of central idea in that story of the two boys in the car, in the identical car, seeing each other on that one day and recognizing themselves in each other, and that the tiny line that separates a state of satisfaction and bliss from that sort of infernal feeling that the other character deals with. What are the tiny little bits of history that account for that difference? The tiniest, most minute little adjustments that create that split. And is there a way to recoup that? Is there a way to come back from that? So that was sort of what I was sort of playing with and thinking about in that story. And I was also working with the idea as well that how is the individual connected to these larger historical currents, right? Do they play off against each other? Do they inform each other? Are they at variance sometimes and other times in collusion? And using that as a way to kind of debunk the agony of the personal journey, where it's like, listen, you don't have it so bad, right? There's this horrible stuff happening down the road. And part of your problem is you can't get out of your own little tiny space, right? So for all your scheming and dreaming, you're still responding to the wrong thing. So I was also kind of trying to play around with that a little bit too.
I am really curious for other people I know to read the story so I can talk about it with them also. I think that it's 5:09 and I have one more question that I'd like to ask, and then maybe we can invite some folks to ask questions, or I wanted to go to the very, very last sentence in this book, which is a bit of paratext on the acknowledgements page, where you thank your children. And you thank your children for let me see, I have it right here. I'll read it just so that I get it right. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But most importantly, I'd like to thank my 4 kids, Benjamin, Henry, Molly, and Lucy, who give me a reason to keep going. And I wanted to ask about what that reason was, and where we keep going for.
That's a big question. I think that the short answer for that is, at this point, why bother doing anything if not in some way for them? I mean, the all the sort of stuff you dreamed of doing when you were 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, if you've done any of it, isn't particularly fulfilling in the long run, I don't think. And that's not probably a fair thing to say in some way, because I mean, I've had opportunities and I've had successes that other people haven't had, and I'm very grateful for that. But I think there is something about having kids that kind of reorients your whole your whole sense of priorities, I would say. And I think, I mean, talk about utopia, boy, I sure hope they've got something up their sleeves for the coming 50, 60, 70 years, because it does not look good to me. And I'm not going to be around for another 50, 60 years in the way they are. And I think we are going to need something beyond the sort of pedestrian pragmatics that seem to have completely overtaken our politics. We need to think a lot bigger. And so maybe, the utopian, I do think it's important, even if you can't achieve it, because at least what it suggests is there's the possibility that maybe we can jump out of this track into another one. Maybe we can improve. Maybe there's something better out there. For that alone, it's such an important idea, because without it, all you have is a repetition of what there is. That whole end of history thing that was happening in the 90s. This is as good as it gets. Well, I hope not, because as good as it gets is not nearly very good, not nearly good enough. And in fact, as good as it gets is progressively getting worse. So, yeah, I don't know, long answer to a short question, but yeah.
I obviously ask because I'm also a parent, and
Right.
my eldest is about to graduate high school, and I think about poems and stories, and teaching literature, and what are we, like what those things are for. But also, I think because that note is the hopeful note in this book. That's the note that, like, that our sense of history, which this book takes up quite a bit, is related to what we can imagine the future being like. And many of these utopians walk around in some kind of historical afterlife, like ghosts. They're haunting this space that never was.
Mm-hmm.
They also offer us a vision of what a future might be like.
Mm-hmm.
There were always alternative ideas to how things played out. And
well, the whole notion of studying history is utopian, because the idea, of studying history, the old cliche is those who don't know history are bound to repeat it. That's a utopian idea. What it suggests is if you study your history and you know your history, you might in fact be able to do something that isn't repetition. You might be able to do something that's new and different and jumps the track. And I think that the utopian idea, or the idea of utopia, is important as that kind of operating principle. Whether or not you can ever get there is almost beside the point. It's the hope that we aren't going to repeat, that we are going to solve stuff, that we are going to try and get out of what we're in. Because if not, if everything is repetition, then we're doomed, right? And it's funny, I just read the Elena Ferrante Neapolitan Quartet. And at the end of that book, there's a really amazing 3 or 4 pages where the character of Lena becomes obsessed with the city of Naples and is recounting what she's turned up in her research. And her essential thesis is that there is that human history is a cycle of progress followed by destruction. Progress, destruction, progress, destruction. We build stuff up, we destroy it. We build more stuff up, we destroy it. And that's all it is, over and over and over again. So the idea of any kind of ultimate progress or any kind of eschatological finality, forget it. And the narrator, of course, is always sort of hedging her bets in that novel, because you never know whether she agrees with Lena or not. But and I find that thesis incredibly compelling and attractive in that sort of nihilistic kind of very dark way. But I also like the idea of being a counterbalance to that, which is that there is fiction, there is utopia, there is hope, and there is sufficient willingness to be aware of history so that we can mobilize all these things together and possibly arrive somewhere better. And even if it's as simple as, you know, getting more people to vote, or collecting money to clean up the river, or whatever, you know, I mean, those to me are utopian gestures.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you bring up Ferrante, because one of my friends is out here, Trina Chambers, and she and I have been talking about Ferrante for years, just going back and forth. And it actually, seeing Trina's face here also makes me think a little bit about, there are alternatives to that. That seems like, in some ways, a very Western way of thinking about the passage of history, and that, like, from an Indigenous perspective, that there are models within the world of like a kind of ongoing continuance and survivance that's not about cycles of destruction. But that may be that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
I think there are some questions in the chat.
Antonas, okay, long question. I'll read it. I wonder if you could comment on the North American taste for happy endings in fiction, or failing those, heroic individualism, Cold Mountain, in the face of European history in general, or Hungarian history in particular. I ask because I work in an Eastern European or Central European historical context, and readers in book clubs often ask why there are so few happy endings there. If there are few happy endings there, even in fiction, how can those places help if there are few happy endings there, even in fiction, how can those places help express the hope you talked about in fiction, right? Or are they doomed to melancholy like the work of Sebald and others like him? If the question is too long, forgive me. No need for forgiveness. Wow, lots of questions there. Okay, first of all, yeah, happy endings. I don't trust any of those happy endings. I mean, there's very few happy endings that strike me as valid. That being said, I don't know if that necessarily means endings have to be unhappy. And I'm not even sure where to go with that. I know that my work is frequently cited for being hopeless or unhappy or doom laden. Although I just read a novel this summer called War and War by Laszlo Krasznahorkai, and he puts a whole new meaning to the word hopeless. I don't think that anyone deserves to be called that after reading his book. That book was grim beyond imagining, almost to the point of parody, I thought. Anyway, okay, so for me, endings, I think endings can be, characters can end up in a bad spot without necessarily relinquishing their hopefulness or without relinquishing their humanity. And I think that as long as, and by humanity, I don't mean some sort of humanistic notion of a superiority or anything like that. I simply mean that they can still, to some degree, see themselves as coherent and integral to the world. So I would think that, at least I hope that the stories do, in a sense, end up there. Even a story like Nom de Guerre, where the main character disappears. I think for me, what's hopeful in that story is that nobody gets the final word on that character. Nobody is able to condemn or beatify that character. The multiplicity of interpretations impinging on him are ultimately what save him, because he, like all of us, is too variable to be filed under a single mark of sin that would condemn him forever, right? So that's what I'm trying to do at the ending of that story, even though to the eye, I think it probably seems quite hopeless what happens to him. So that's how I kind of think about a lot of the endings there. And then I think actually individuality, I think that's really interesting, especially in the context of Central and Eastern European literature, because normally when you think of individualism as a kind of cultural value, you tend to think of American literature, right? Where the individual is really the linchpin for the entire ethos, right? When things happen, they happen to an individual. When historical events take place, they take place because of an individual. When society considers what's best in it, it always thinks of the individual, right? American culture is completely imbued with this idea that there is nothing that takes place that is not attributable to the individual. Whereas in other cultures, there's more of a sense of a kind of collective, a contingent collective, right? Where we're all dependent on each other and we're all products of that dependency and of that web, that interwoven kind of web, to the point of infinity, where you're never sure, where you begin and end. And I think that that's probably more true in my work, that there is this kind of set of contingencies in enmeshing the individuals. And in many cases, they're aware of it. And it's precisely trying to sort that out and get to the individual that's either their problem, because that's not what they should be doing, or in rejecting that, it becomes what helps them in some way. That being said, I grew up in a Hungarian family, which was very much about individual merit. Who's better at this? Who's worse at this? What are you good at? And what's she good at? What's he bad at? What's, like all of that sort of stuff. It was very individualistic, but in a weird deterministic kind of way. So it was, my father would always say, oh, he's good at X. He must have gotten that from ancestor Y. So there was no individual agency. Everything came from somewhere else, and it was automatic, and it just made you who you are, and you had no choice. So on the one hand, individualistic, on the other hand, not at all individualistic, right? Because it's both of those things at the same time. And my work is obsessed with that. It runs through every story. I deal with that. Okay. Rolf wants us to move back to the short story novel thing. Okay, let's do that, Rolf. Antonas, I don't know if I got to your last two questions, but maybe that's good enough for now, and we can continue it over email or something. So, Rolf, do you have a particular question or?
I'm unmuted. Yes, that I thought that was a really interesting tangent also. And surely it is a part, the rite of passage, part of the rite of passage for every short story writer, that interview, that conversation with the editor who says, gee, we really love your short fiction here. Tell me, have you ever thought of going long? And from my perspective, it's not a matter of like a metaphor people sometimes use is distance running or something like that. But to me, it's more like the distinction between sculpture and painting, for instance. They are completely different forms from the very first letter that you type. And you kind of made that point as well. What I do want to say about your collection here, however, which is quite novelistic, is that you create a novelistic world that spans all the stories. In fact, every one of the stories could easily happen in this same world, which is quite different from ours in certain key details. It's not our world that we're living in. There's a few differences, but it's internally the same world. And there's no reason why Ray Electric and Sandor Esterhazy couldn't have crossed paths or shared a bus ride at one point. And
Right.
even Spires, which I think of as the West Coast story, it recognizably happens in the same space-time continuum, the same novelistic world. So there is that big unity. And in fact, behind the scenes thing, we did make a substitution in the collection. And one of the things that, one of the reasons for that is the other story, which is a perfectly fine story, was in a different universe. It took place at a different kind of sensibility. And so we made that change. And part of what works for me about the collection is it creates, you're not just immersed in each story, you're immersed in a much bigger world. And the same thing with Siege 13 for that matter. And that to me is part of the charm and attraction and part of the fun ride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had never really thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. These characters could appear and sometimes do appear in the stories. The story you substituted in the collection, the Teleki story, he's a character from Siege 13. So, the people who've read Siege 13 and want to find out what happens to him should read that story, because it tells you what happens to him, kind of, or what happens to his avatar in any case. So some of the characters do reappear in various stories. Maybe I'm just kind of hoping that at some point they will have reappeared in each other's stories enough that I can just put out a collected stories and call it a novel. And then everyone will be happy. I don't know.
Maybe Ghost Geographies is your utopian novel. Like it's fractured, multiple, doesn't like kind of have that ideological bent that all novels must have, it has some other kind of like way of thwarting that.
Yeah, it's possible. I'm so tired of being asked to write novels. Oh my God. Clint says, reminds me of Pessoa. Yeah, interesting. Do you want to elaborate on that, Clint? Are you there? You must be out there somewhere.
I just imagine you, Tamas, putting on a raincoat and going out in a different, like as a different person each day.
Yeah. Well, I've actually been really intrigued by his idea of writing under these heteronyms, that you would write through a series of persona that would have different stylistic features depending on which persona you'd chosen to write your work, to the point where the personas are commenting on each other's work and criticizing each other for being shoddy at what they're doing. I think that's totally brilliant and incredible. I've started writing a series of stories from a first-person point of view of characters who happen to know this guy called Dobozy, who's an idiot. and all the stories are like, these narrators running down this guy called Dobozy. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get enough of them to make a whole book out of it, but it's been fun to try and jump out of the persona I write when I write first person and to pointedly adopt a different first person place and to foreground that by putting myself into the story in the third person as an object of this narrator's derision. So that I'm kind of playing around with that a little bit and seeing what I can do with it. Because I want to continue writing in the first person, but I'm kind of tired of writing from a place that's very closely allied to where I'm sitting. So that's down the road.
I am just going to jump back in here to say that I did unmute Clint if he does want to jump in, but no worries if not, Clint.
Yes. Sorry, Tamas, just jumping back to something that I remember us talking like, oh my God, 30 years ago or something. Didn't you do something about Pessoa? You were certainly doing some Portuguese writers.
I was reading a lot of Portuguese writing at one point, including Pessoa. And there was a couple of conferences there in Lisbon that I went to that really got me very intrigued by the whole Portuguese writing scene that I didn't know anything about at all prior to going. And he was one of the figures who came up, partly because in Lisbon they have little statues of him sitting around on the street, and they have a cafe where there's a table. I think there's either a statue there or the table's kind of set aside because that's where he used to sit. And so you're walking around Lisbon and you're running into Pessoa everywhere. And then I saw a play that was put on where they kind of had his various persona, his various heteronyms meeting each other on stage and arguing and fighting and having it out with each other, which was amazing and intriguing. So yeah, I'm always interested in that, how can you expand the
complicate the narrative,
the frame, yeah. I just I got a book from New Star arrived yesterday by accident. It was Lisa Robertson's The Weather, and I opened it up and there's a piece of paper inside folded up, and I open it up and it's like a letter, and I thought, is this supposed to be in the book or not? Like, why is this a separate document tucked into this? And I thought, that's incredible. What a great idea. These sort of bits of paper that fall out of a book and that somehow are part of the book and not part of the book. I think that's really, really an intriguing idea. And I don't know if you've seen Anne Carson's poem Knox. It comes in a box and you open it up and it's this huge accordion of paper that expands and expands and expands. Just the idea there of playing with frames in every way to kind of shock the reader out of a kind of set of expectations around what fiction is or isn't or could or couldn't be.
You're questioning the reality, like in the case of the piece of paper falling out of Lisa Robertson's book. You don't know if that was intentional or not intentional.
Yeah, is this or is this not part? And I think that's the problem with genre. This is a genre problem, right? When we sit down to read a short story or a novel, we've already got a set of preemptive expectations that have been given to us by our system of literary education that, in a sense, disarms the text before you've even come to it. It's hard to believe that, but there used to be a time, if you read Thomas Nash or these Renaissance writers or these early modern writers, who were writing something that was not yet really classified as fiction, much less novella or short story or novel. It would be interesting. How did the people reading that feel? What did they think they were reading? What was that in front of them? And can we get back to that? Because I think it would be great if we could. You know. I once had a dinner with an academic, and I told her I'd written a fake essay and published it in a journal, and I'd made up everything. I'd made up the argument, all the research material, everything was made up, and yet it was formatted completely MLA style, like a straight up academic paper. And she said, "Oh, you shouldn't do that. It's dangerous." And I thought, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. And in a way, that was my point, that just because something is presented to you as nonfiction, should you automatically assume that this written text has veracity, that what it's telling you is true?
Camouflage of form.
That's a genre problem, right? Sorry, what?
The camouflage of form.
Yeah. Right. So, and Black-Hearted Villains, when I first sent that story to Agni and they sent me the contract, it was for nonfiction. And they said, and I was like, oh no, I got to tell them it's fiction. They're going to reject it. And I really wanted to get into Agni. So for a while I thought, I just won't tell them, I'll just sign it and they can run it as nonfiction and I'm just going to not care. But I thought, no, I better tell them, because if they get in trouble and I get in trouble, I might never be allowed to publish there again. So I told them and they said, oh, wow, that's incredible. All of this was made up, really? And I said, yeah, every word. And so then they sent me another contract for fiction, and it found its proper way into the journal. But to me, that's really interesting. You know, the idea that you can borrow a tone or a voice from another genre, stick it into the short story, and suddenly readers don't know what they're reading or how to dispose themselves to the text. And what that should do is actually alert them to their agency in front of the text, which is stripped away when you go, oh, I'm reading a novel. Okay, I can relax. No, this is true. Oh, I'm reading journalism. Okay, this is all going to be true. So I'm going to do that. What happens if you don't know? Then suddenly you have to decide based on what's in front of you what it is. And I think awakening to that agency is actually really important. That we've lost that, especially now with Twitter and Facebook and now what's Trump's thing called? Truth something. You know, like, if ever there was a time when we need to wake up to what we're reading and its claims, its generic claims, now is it.
It's 5:40. I know that some folks need to go. There's some more conversation. Maybe, I know that Tamas doesn't mind staying longer to answer questions, but I wondered if you wanted to give some like direction on where folks can buy the book and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll also just remind everyone that this launch is recorded and it'll be up online in the next few days. So make sure you're keeping up with us on our newsletter and through social media as well. Ghost Geography is available online in all of the usual places, but it is also available in your local independent bookstore right across Canada. And we really do strongly encourage you to support those local independent booksellers. You can find a list of bookstores that are currently stocking Ghost Geographies in the latest news post on our website, which is newstarbooks.com. Before anyone else needs to filter out, I will just also say thank you to Tamas and to you as well, Matt, for this wonderful event, and for everyone who has tuned in from far and wide. We really are appreciative of you guys joining us. We do wish that we could do this in person, and hopefully one day soon we will, but until then we will see you all next time. But yeah, thank you again for joining, everyone. And if anyone does want to stick around, we'll leave it open if Tamas, you want to answer some more questions.
Yeah, I think, Janos has a question I'd love to talk to him about. But I will say thanks to everyone who came, and to Matt and everyone at New Star for putting this together and putting out the book. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to stick around and hear your answers too. So,
Okay. All right. So Janos asked a great question. What were your criteria for deciding which short stories of the past many years should be published in this new volume? For example, why did you decide on Ghost Geographies and not on Neglected Lands, which I think is a later version of Ghost Geographies? Yeah, that's a great question, Janos. I think I knew more or less which stories were going to go into the book because they had that, what Matt has identified as that sort of common interest in the utopian, in all the many ways we've been talking about it tonight. It's interesting that you bring up Neglected Lands, because the difference between Ghost Geographies and Neglected Lands is actually exactly the problem I've been having with writing short stories in that kind of slice of life way versus trying to do something different. And I think Ghost Geographies is successful in a way that Neglected Lands wasn't. Neglected Lands was it couldn't generate enough scope, or it couldn't generate enough how do I put it? It just didn't, I couldn't get it to resonate properly because it was so confined to the viewpoint of that one character who's the border guard, observing Esterhazy coming and going back and forth. Whereas with the essay form that I used for Ghost Geographies, I could wander and extend and go in all ways with the material. So I do see Neglected Lands as being less successful, and that's why I didn't include it. I'm not sure if Neglected Lands came later. It was published later, but I don't know if I wrote it later. I think I may in fact have written Ghost Geographies out of frustration with Neglected Lands, actually. So I think Ghost Geographies might have been the later story, though I work on stuff for so long, over so many years, constantly revising that might not be correct. But anyway, that's the answer to that question.
Do you feel like we have a sense of completeness here, Tamas?
Sure, why not? as close as we're going to get.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again to everyone. Hi, Dawn. Yeah, thanks, Matt, again, and Rolf and Melissa as well. Thank Vlad for me. I don't know, he's traveling somewhere, I imagine.
He's in Romania right now.
Oh, okay.
So it's what, about 4 or 5 in the morning there, I think.
Right. Okay. Well, say thank you to him for me as well, and I guess we'll talk again soon.
Wonderful.
For sure.
Okay. Thanks everyone for
All right.
sticking around.
Good night, everyone.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.